Hello, my friends. It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And yesterday I hinted at something terribly, terribly menacing. Maybe it stuck with a few of you. It was just in passing. But I was talking about how there are a couple different versions of the book of Esther that date back to the very ancient world. And maybe that's the kind of thing that sets off all sorts of alarm bells and raises questions like, well, how do we know that we got the right one? And is it weird that Christians read more than one version of the book of Esther? And does this raise questions about how the whole Bible in general works? And probably all of those are pretty fair questions, certainly things that I have asked and thought about. And so over the next couple of conversations, as we're right here between Esther chapter 4 and Esther chapter 5, I want to just step back from the story for a moment and talk about not the historical background of Esther, like Persia and all of that we've been talking about, but I want to talk about the history of the book of Esther and how it has unfolded and been handed down to us, and why there is an original Hebrew version. We're looking at the English translation of that, and why there is more stuff that all parties who care about these things, Catholic, Orthodox, Jews, Protestants, would refer to as additions to Esther that came after the fact. But before we get into all of that stuff, I would like to complain for a minute about Disney. Not just in general. I don't know. They're trying hard or whatever. You can think whatever you want about Disney, I guess. But I am not jiving with these live action remakes. I wanted them to work. I really did. But the magic, it doesn't come through the same way. Maybe there's something about what you can do with animation, and it just doesn't work when you got human actors against a green screen. Maybe it's a matter that we just already know how well the story can be told because we do have the animated versions. And so these all just sort of ring hollow because I already saw a better version of that movie. And I'm not alone in this. The box office seems to agree with my assessment. I mean, to call the reception of these movies lukewarm would be, I think, pretty generous. So it could be any of those reasons that it's not working out. But you know what I really think it is? I think it's the themes. I think that the theme maketh the story. And there's only so much that you can mess with the themes that undergird a timeless classic story before it really isn't that story anymore, and it's no longer a timeless classic. It just doesn't work now. Think about how many times you've seen, it's funny, people still talk about this like it's all edgy and clever. It's going to be a modern reimagining of the classic tale. How many times have you seen that and you're like, that was great, nailed it? Now, how many times have you seen that and you're like, that kind of rang hollow? I don't know. It just couldn't put my finger on why that didn't work, but it feels like it kind of didn't work. For me, it's the latter. It very rarely works. And so you might like the themes that of late Disney has tried to work into their storytelling. You might not resonate with those themes. That's not the point. The point is that sometimes when you try to add a new theme to an existing story, it really deeply changes the meaning and it's going to hit very differently. This is true of the book of Esther. The original Hebrew version, as best as we can tell, is the version that has been translated into English that you and I are looking at and working through here. You will notice that in this version, the author is very cagey, very mum about exactly what to make of all of these characters. Esther doesn't really blossom into any kind of hero until where we're at, right here at the end of chapter 4. Mordecai does a couple of things that look pretty good, but his motives aren't clear for those things. And it's possible you could even read this story to say Mordecai's pride put the neck of all of the Jews, all of his people, on the line. The author of Esther presents these two as talented and as movers and shakers, as people of influence and attentiveness, but not necessarily as high character or godly. Well, why? You and I have talked about that quite a bit. There's a clump of literature here that starts in the late 600s BC and that runs all the way up into the mid 400s BC with Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. And the theme in this chunk of time, in this epoch of the Old Testament story, is the theme of what happens when you're in exile. What happens when there is no theocracy? What happens when God is not king? What happens when the temple is not functioning? What happens when you're an alien and a stranger and an outsider? What does it look like to do faith then? And it's a really important theme because it portends how everything is going to work out in the New Testament and the entire age of the history of the church. I mean, this idea of Christians being aliens and strangers in a hostile foreign land is pretty pronounced throughout the New Testament. And indeed, when Jeremiah, at the very end of the kingdom of Judah, right before Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers it and destroys the temple, Jeremiah, in a very famous passage in his book that there for a 5 or 10 year stretch was one of the most popular parts of the Bible to use for lower back tattoos. He tells the people of Judah, hey, you're going to be taken. It's the taken passage. You're going to go into captivity. There's no stopping it. This is ordained. God's going to punish you. But while you're there, what you need to do is live as good citizens in the city. You need to be exemplary there. You need to be, to use kind of New Testament language, a preservative there. Do good, do right, honor the king, behave well. And the idea is that they will be blessed while they're in exile and captivity, but also that they will be a blessing to others. Now that's the same concept we see introduced in the covenant that God makes with Abraham clear back at the beginning of the Old Testament, that God is going to make a great nation of the descendants of Abraham and that they will be blessed by God, but also the nations will be blessed by the descendants of Abraham. So now we're seeing that play out as we get into the 6th century and the 5th century with the Babylonians and then with the Persians coming in. And now when we get to the book of Esther in the 5th century, in the 480s and the 470s, we're really seeing this friction play out. What does it look like for somewhat secularized Jews to respond to the circumstances of exile in a way that is good, that's in keeping with the big redemptive plan of what God is doing? And Ezra and Nehemiah deal with a lot of the same questions. The answers to these things aren't obvious to the original audience. They're in a new epoch, a new moment in their relationship with God and in their relationship with their neighbors. So these were very important books that thematically hit that same point of emphasis: how to live in exile, how to honor God when you are just one of many people among the nations living under a human ruler who at times is cool and at times is an idiot. So I think part of the reason that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther all stood the test of time was that they were so very thematically relevant in terms of how they told the story, and especially Esther, which is just thick, rich, creamy, juicy storytelling, and it leans so heavily on the themes therein. The idea of God's invisible providence, that theme is so important to the original version of Esther, because the people reading this, the Jews in exile, would have been like, well, it seems like we don't see God do stuff the way we used to see him do it. Seems like maybe he works in new ways. He doesn't obviously break the laws of time and space all the time like it seems like he used to. What's with that? Well, in Esther, God isn't even named, and he's still the hero of the book. Some people look at the original version of Esther that we're looking at, and they say, no, Esther is the hero. But I don't see that. I think Esther blossoms into a hero at about the midway point of the book, but without the providence of God lining up all of these circumstances, as hinted at by Mordecai, maybe even unwittingly here at the end of chapter 4, when he says, and who knows but that you've come to a royal position for a time such as this. I mean, without the providence of God, this doesn't work. God is the hero in the original Hebrew version of the book of Esther that we're working through. And God is also the hero of the later Greek version that we're going to talk about next time around, that crops up 100, 200, 250 years after this original version. But in order to understand why those Greek additions to the book of Esther happened, we got to look at the decline and fall of the Persian Empire. We have to look at the rise of Alexander the Great and the empires born out of his march of conquest. And we have to consider the effect that that had on Jewish people in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and maybe even on into the 1st century BC. And I think what we're going to see as we look more closely at that is that the additions to Esther are an attempt to tag on new themes to a beloved existing story, to make it more relevant to the questions Jews were asking in a post-Alexander the Great world that were very different from the questions that Jews were asking in a Xerxes Persian world 150, 200 years earlier. Then when we're done with all of that, next episode or the episode after, we'll actually look at some of these additions, and you can consider whether these after-the-fact additions that, again, all parties involved, Catholic, Orthodox, Jews, Protestants, all parties involved agree are later additions. Nobody's arguing that this is the original version. The debate is just about what you do with these later additions and evolutions. And like I said, we're going to look at some of those, and you'll quickly see how it really reframes the whole theme here. And then you can decide for yourself if it's a helpful reframing or if it's something to just be acknowledged as a historical artifact, and then just turn our attention right back to the original version of Esther that we're looking at here. I kind of think the latter. Okay, more on the history of Esther and the later Greek additions to the book of Esther next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
Thank you to all of you who have taken the time to leave a rating and review on your podcast apps. We're grateful because it's encouraging and it helps new people find their way here.